This is an open hearing of the independent inquiry into matters relating to Afghanistan. Please ensure that all mobile phones and other personal electronic devices are either switched off or in silent mode. Please may I draw your attention to the fact that the Chair of the inquiry, the Right Honourable Lord Justice Haddon-Cave, has made a restriction order dated 22nd of January 2025 in relation to the conduct of those who are attending the hearing. The full order is displayed on the inquiry website and on the door of this court and of the media annex, but I will summarise its purpose. The first part of the order, which applies to this and to all future hearings of the inquiry, prohibits any person from making an audio or video recording of inquiry proceedings from within the hearing rooms without the express permission of the Chair. Furthermore, no person may take a photograph in any room in which inquiry proceedings are taking place and at a time the inquiry is sitting without the express permission of the Chair. For the avoidance of doubt, both of these prohibitions extend to the hearing in the media annex. The second part of the order, which applies to this hearing, arises as the live stream of these inquiry proceedings via YouTube will purposely be subject to a 10-minute delay. Where those who have supplied evidence to the inquiry have applied to restrict information from publication outside of the inquiry, in some instances the Chair has made restriction orders, the effect of which is to protect that information. For the avoidance of doubt, where material or identities in documents shown on screen or subsequently published have been redacted with or without an overwritten gist, the redacted material is restricted, and it is a breach of the restriction order to disclose what is thought to have been redacted. A restriction order prohibits the use, publication, or dissemination of the information that it covers. In the event that something is said during the course of this hearing which may breach a restriction order made by the Chair, the evidence may be halted and the hearing room and annex may be cleared for closed legal submissions as to whether any restriction order has been breached, and the live stream YouTube recording will be temporarily stopped for this period. Counsel to the inquiry or the solicitor to the inquiry must be informed of any request to make an application for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes. If an application is made for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes, anything that was said or done during that period is subject to a restriction order prohibiting its disclosure, repetition or duplication until the Chair has finally determined the application. Every restriction order is subject to a penal notice. This means that any breach of any element of the restriction orders may be certified to the High Court or the Court of Session, who will have the power to fine or imprison anyone found to have been in breach of the order. All rise.
Mr. Glasgow.
Good morning, sir. We're turning to deal with a new chapter of the evidence today, and we're going to call Alan Pughsley, who's the policing expert who's provided a report in respect of his examination of Operation Northmoor and Operation Sestro. So could I please ask for Mr. Pughsley to step forward?
Good morning, Mr. Pughsley.
Good morning.
Can the witness be sworn, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Could you give the court your full name, please, sir?
It's Alan Pughsley.
And Mr. Pughsley, you very politely stood while I've asked the first question, but in fact you may find that it's a little more comfortable if you sit down if you want to.
Thank you. I will.
Can I check that you have available to you a black file which contains both your report as well as the executive summary of your report?
That is correct, Chair, yes.
And do you also have the various supporting documents, which I believe comprise now 4 bundles?
That is correct, yes.
We will be looking at different parts of both that small file as well as the other black files. Can I suggest, as a note of caution, it might be prudent to move the jug of water now before you use it to wash down either yourself or the report in about 15 minutes' time?
Thank you. I don't need it, Mark.
Now, Mr. Pughsley, before we embark on your evidence, I've already introduced it in part, since I've indicated to the Chair that we will be calling an expert in policing matters. And we will turn to look first of all at your executive summary and then go to the various chapters in your report. But before we embark on any of that, first this, please. Can you give us an idea of your relevant experience and expertise that enables you to be an expert for us today to help us with the RMP investigations?
Yes, so I'm a recently retired police officer, having served for 39 years service, mainly in the Metropolitan Police and Kent Police, where I retired as the Chief Constable, having served for 9 years as the Chief in Kent. I think you could categorise my whole service as dealing with serious and organised crime, from junior investigating roles all the way through to supervisors, managers, and then Chief Constable overseeing serious, complex and challenging cases, and therefore all elements of that, the roles, the processes, the managerial role, supervisory role, and indeed investigation role for many years.
So if we try to look at that in summary, we need to consider both regional and national appointments during your career?
Yes, so nationally, in fact, my last role nationally was the Chief Constable in charge of the Crime Coordinating Committee, which included serious and organised crime nationally. Yes, worked regionally with many forces and other agencies, and of course locally then running, as I say, Kent Police. So the whole spectrum, national, regional and local.
Thank you. And in terms of the roles that you've carried out in those various capacities, do they include operational roles, so actually in direct involvement in the conducting and management of investigations into serious criminal offences?
Yeah, yes, they do. So most recently that would be as a Chief Constable above Gold, overseeing Gold setup, SIO setups, process and investigations. Gold for many years, and indeed before that, many leading and investigating serious and organised crime.
And in terms of the oversight roles that you've held, do those include positions in which you have created and implemented operational strategy?
Yes, they do. That is absolutely the role nationally of the Chief Constable from a Crime Coordinating Committee for all forces to follow. So national process, national strategy and national good practice. And indeed then more locally, of course, as the Chief Constable, you have absolute responsibility for policy, procedure and compliance with the same in the organisation that you have ultimate responsibility for.
And before we go any further, perhaps a note of caution as to the ambit of your expertise, if I may. Do you have any prior military experience?
No, I've never worked with the military alongside through operational policing, as you would expect, but I've never been part of or worked with the military in any detail.
And before being asked by the inquiry to carry out a review such as this, have you previously conducted any review or oversight or assurance into a military investigation?
No, I have not.
So if we understand your expertise and experience is limited to a civilian context?
It is limited to a civilian context into serious and organised murder investigations.
And I was going to check, that includes murder as well as other serious and organised criminal investigations?
Yes, it does.
Now, you were contacted by the solicitor of the inquiry, Piers Doggett, in September of 2023, inviting you to consider 7 topics which he had asked you to look at in your main report, which you can find in the small lever bundle, if you turn to tab B and to page 2, please. So it'll be the small ring binder, I'm so sorry. So the one that's, I hope the one that's open in front of you at the moment. Divider B should contain your main report if it's tabbed the same way as mine.
Thank you.
If we look together to page 2 for a moment, Mr. Pughsley, you've identified on that page and overleaf 7 separate topics which you were invited to consider as part of your review and the report. And if we just look to them very briefly together, if we may, the first topic was the inception of Operation Northmoor up until July of 2016.
That is correct, Chair, yes.
The second topic was the investigative strategy for Operation Northmoor from July 2016 onwards.
Once again, correct.
Then you were asked to look at the decision to close Operation Northmoor.
That is correct.
And then separately, you were invited to consider the capability of Operation Northmoor,
That is correct, Chair.
the leadership and command structure that had been put in place,
That is correct.
and then the investigative strategy for Operation Sestro.
That is correct, yes.
And then you've been invited to consider the overall strategy that had been used by the RMP in both of those investigations.
That is correct, yes.
And before we go any further with your evidence, although you were instructed by the solicitor to the inquiry to provide the report, do you owe a duty to the inquiry, or do you owe, as in the solicitor, or in fact do you owe a duty to the chair to give evidence that is unbiased and free from any outside influence?
I do, yes.
When we go through your evidence over the course of today and into tomorrow, if at any stage I take you to a document which you can't find, or if I ask a question which doesn't make sense, and that is bound to happen, will you try as best to let me know as politely as possible? And I'll either find the document for you or rephrase the question.
I understand, yes. Thank you.
And during the course of the day, both today and tomorrow, we will be taking breaks. If at any stage you want a break, will you please let me know?
I will.
Now, what I would like to do with your help, first of all, please, is to just identify the limitations that there might be for the exercise that you and I are going to embark on. Clearly, Operation Northmoor and Operation Sestro were significant investigations into allegations of very serious misconduct.
I believe they certainly were.
And lots of individuals from the RMP, as well as independent advisors and reviewers, were involved.
Yes, they were.
As far as the report that you have been provided, have you been involved in speaking to any individual witnesses or indeed contacting anyone for further information, or have you focused simply on the documentation with which you have been provided?
It's the latter, Chair. I've only seen documentation provided to me for my consideration and understanding and then comment.
So it would be fair to describe what you have embarked on thus far as a paper-based review.
Paper-based review entirely. I've been in this room on one occasion.
And indeed, the one occasion when you did attend this room was that for the evidence of now Brigadier Rochell, at the time Colonel Rochell.
That is correct, Chair, yes.
Again, so you and others can identify the structure and how we're going to try to approach this, I'm going to endeavour with your help to identify the headlines and some of the more important themes that will be relevant when we consider your evidence.
I understand.
It's not proposed at this stage to descend into all of the granular detail, but the purpose is, though, that anyone who wants to consider the exercise on which you have embarked is able to understand it.
I understand, yes.
And also so that the RMP and their witnesses and any other core participant is alive to potential criticisms that might be made by you at some point.
I understand.
But what we're going to do is to identify provisional conclusions rather than final conclusions.
I understand, Chair, yes.
And can I explain that to you and indeed to anyone else in case they are understanding why we're calling an expert only to deal with provisional conclusions? The plan, as you are aware, I hope, is that following receipt of evidence from the Royal Military Police and following the calling and presentation of any of that evidence, there will be a further opportunity for you to offer your opinions and conclusions about Operation Northmoor and Operation Sestro.
Yes, that's my understanding.
It may be that the provisional conclusions you've reached on the paper-based review still hold good and you will stand by them. It may be, having seen the evidence and heard what some of the witnesses have to say, that you will revise those provisional conclusions. We can't know what will happen at this stage.
Absolutely, yes, correct.
But what I'm going to do is to give you, I hope, an opportunity, as well as everyone listening and the core participants, to understand the exercise on which you've embarked, the provisional conclusions that you have reached. So when we come on to consider the evidence on behalf of the RMP in due course, everyone will be better informed of the sorts of themes and issues that are likely to arise.
I understand.
And you will, of course, in due course, be provided with a further opportunity either to submit an additional report or, if necessary, to give further evidence so that you can expand on, clarify, revise, completely change any conclusion that you've offered over the course of the next 2 days.
That all makes sense, yes, thank you.
Now, before we embark on the overview of some of your evidence, what I'd like to try to do is to identify the provisional conclusions that you have reached, since it might assist everyone if we have those at the outset, and they can bear those in mind when we turn to the body of your report.
Yes.
To make it easier for you and for everyone else, if we stick with the ring binder file that you've currently got open, if we were to turn back to divider A and to your executive summary, please. What I would like to do with your help is to look at some of the provisional conclusions that you have reached. And to embark on that, can we turn first to page 2 behind tab A, to the bottom of the page where you start your section headed Findings. And we'll see, of course, that your findings are broken down into the various topics that we'd identified at the outset. You focus on 6 such topics.
That's correct.
The first topic, which is headed Operation Northmoor, Inception to July 2016. Can we turn initially first to paragraph 15 to the bottom of page 3 for this reason? You set out there your overall conclusion as regards the inception to July period. You identify there that Northmoor had been declared a Category A+ investigation, one which is extraordinarily serious and or complex and will require out of the ordinary resourcing. And then you observed, I have found that the strategies adopted and implemented by Gold and the SIO during this period did not progress the investigation at the pace, breadth or depth that is required for a Category A+ investigation.
That is correct, yes. That was my finding on that period.
Can we just look very briefly to the first few paragraphs that lead up to that conclusion? Can I take you back to paragraph 11 for a moment, Mr. Pughsley?
Yes.
You identify here the initial delay in relation to the commencement of the investigation significantly affected the proficiency of Operation Northmoor, both at its beginnings and throughout.
That is absolutely my finding.
Can we identify straight away, though, that you observe that this is not in any way a fault of the RMP?
That is correct.
So that's the initial delay in relation to the commencement of the investigation. As to the significance of that initial delay, can you help us, please, with what you think the consequences were for Operation Northmoor caused by the delay to it beginning?
I can. So in any serious investigation, and one of this magnitude, that's for sure, early attendance at any scene gives a huge amount of opportunity, not only for scene attendance, but potentially to identify witnesses, suspects, forensic opportunities, and such like, that are crucial in my view, and indeed for the murder manual, for any serious, successful investigation. Those crucial opportunities were simply not afforded to RMP investigators until some 3 years later. So those contemporaneous accounts of witnesses and or suspects, if there were any, and forensic opportunities and independent data and video footage, whatever that may have been, was simply not afforded to the SIO or the Gold Commander.
And we will, of course, come to consider each of these conclusions in due course and to see whether that opportunity, if afforded, was a realistic one or not, given the context in which any investigation was being conducted. But you've identified there straight away potential consequences to the investigation as a result of the delay to its start. And the delay, so we're clear, in effect was one of 3 years.
One of 3 years until March 2014, yes.
And Mr. Pughsley, that first opportunity is called the golden hour generally?
So it is, Chair, yes. So the golden hour, maybe hour leads a false sense of security. It's wider than just the hour. It's the initial response to any investigation. And something like this, if you could have, you know, and I accept the operational environment that maybe Mr. Glasgow was getting at there. But if you can visit the scene, I think you can still identify the witnesses and/or suspects if there were any, and wider forensic opportunities. The golden hour is the principle: early control, early grip of an investigation.
Just moving on, if we may, whilst we consider your findings, or at least your provisional findings in respect of the first topic. So this is the period inception to July 2016. Did you identify that there was some evidence of good practice within the early months of the investigation?
I did, and accepting earlier the element of non-military background. This is a murder investigation, and if my understanding is correct, and everything I found was, the RMP were trying to investigate this in the same way any other murder investigation would take place, in a Home Office force, with, of course, the additionality of any military doctrine and/or rules. So the good practice I saw at an early stage in that regard was structure, firstly. A Gold Commander was appointed very early, and that person was also supported with an early appointment of an SIO, Senior Investigating Officer.
Did you also identify that the SIO complied with best practice in the keeping of regular and detailed policy file reports?
Both SIOs, so this period, absolutely yes, and the one that follows.
Thank you. Did you identify any concerns, however, with the structure and how the investigation was operating?
Yes, I did. So the Gold Commander and the Gold groups are crucial to supporting and driving forward an investigation of this nature, supportive to the SIO and/or everything that person's trying to do, and directing, because Gold should direct the strategy by which the SIO leads the investigation. The lack of Gold groups in 14, 15, this period up to 16, I am surprised by. I would have expected them, from any experienced Gold Commander, and/or the manual, and/or any advice from advisors, to be on a monthly basis.
Did you identify any particular failings in the Gold Commander where he failed to explain his decision-making at all?
Yes, I found little records by the Gold Commander at this time. The Gold minutes were scant, so if the Gold Commander was relying on those as his record, then I'm afraid he would be very disappointed.
In terms of the progress that the investigation made, either in an overt sense or through the use of covert strategies, was proper progress made during this period between inception and July 2016?
No, I found very little progress in this period. And from an overt point of view, firstly, very few key witnesses were seen at this period of time, and roughly a 2-year period we're talking of course. There also seemed to be very little acquisition of data and digital product that could have assisted the inquiry. So that those two main key areas were not progressed, in my view, in a timely manner.
And in terms of the decision to follow best Home Office practice and apply it to a military context, you told us that a Gold Commander had been appointed and then a Senior Investigating Officer. Was any decision taken to use independent advisors or assistance from outside agencies in order to better inform the investigation?
Yes, there was, I think, a good decision by the PMA, if I understand it correctly at the time, in that they brought in two groups of independent advisors. Advisor individually from the National Crime Agency, who was both an advisor and a mentor through this period, and a independent murder inquiry review team from Greater Manchester. So it had two advising and supporting external agencies.
In terms of the assistance that was provided by those two outside agencies, were you able to uncover whether or not the advice was heeded when it was provided?
I'm afraid not. From the documents I've read, they are consistent and growing concern. So there are. It appears that their recorded concerns were largely ignored.
Right. And is that what led you to your provisional finding that the strategies adopted and implemented by both Gold and the senior investigating officer did not progress the investigation at the pace, breadth or depth required for an investigation of this seriousness?
That is correct, Chair, yes.
Could we have your help then, please, as regards the second topic that you were invited to consider at the outset when instructed, and that's the investigative strategy from July 2016 onwards?
Yes.
If we look, please, straight away to your paragraph 16 in the executive summary, you identify that a number of the key roles in the investigation changed in this period of time.
Again, that is correct, Chair. So we had a change of PMA at this time. Within a similar time period, a number of months, I think at best, we had a change of Gold Commander. And at some stage, I think the two SIOs are running side by side, but eventually the SIO initially is replaced about 12 months or thereabouts after Brigadier Neal's appointment.
Is there any significance to the effectiveness of an operation such as this if key personnel change at around the same sort of time as each other?
I think any change is a risk. Any change of any significant role, and we've just mentioned three of them there, the PMA, the Gold Commander and the SIO. Any change represents a risk, and the way, in my experience, that is dealt with is with detailed, careful handover individually between each roles. To change two of the significant roles within a number of months, I think, was a bit too risky, and I haven't found in my examination of the documents detailed notes regarding those handovers. So I can only comment on what I've read, I'm afraid.
So you've not had sight of any handover notes. It may be that they exist, but you've not yet been provided with them. It may be that they don't exist at all.
Correct. The only one that's referenced through the documents I've found is SIO Captain Wright. He records that he will have an handover with Major Cox, but I haven't found the handover notes. The other two, Gold and PMA, I've not found any records.
Just picking up then on the handover from Captain Wright as the first senior investigating officer to Major Cox, who then became the new SIO. You told us previously that Captain Wright had shown best practice in the way in which he'd approached keeping a record of his decisions and indeed in the policy file.
Correct.
Was a similar approach adopted by Major Cox, the new SIO?
Yeah, again, I think his record keeping was very good.
And other than the change in those important, significant roles, that's PMA, Gold, and a little later the SIO, what about the original advisors who have been brought on board to help? Did they continue in their role, or were they changed?
So they were changed. So importantly, the change of PMA and Gold Commander brought in some new advisors. The advisors were Sir John Murphy and Mr. Ellison, with regard to advice and guidance to the new PMA, and indeed a new investigation review team, this time from Merseyside Police. There is a period, though, where it appears that there are 4 advisors helping the RMP, and I can't really narrow that down exactly how long that went on for, because I couldn't find a closing document for either the NCA or the MERT, but there is a period where I believe, certainly from documentation, quite a confusing landscape of 4 sets of advisors.
And it may be that you've answered the question already by describing it as a confusing landscape, and it may be that it's obvious, but what are the risks presented to an investigation such as Operation Northmoor if there then becomes a surplus of advisors from outside offering their opinion or assistance?
Well, different advice is probably the main risk. I'm sure we'll come to it later on. You know, some of the decisions, really tough, tricky decisions that SIOs and Gold had to make. Some, in my view, are very, very finely balanced. And if you've got one advisor with all the experience saying A and another advisor saying Z, that's a bit tricky for anybody taking that advice to then choose which course of action.
As far as the instruction of new advisors is concerned, so a new PMA coming in, a new Gold and new advisors being brought with them, would the introduction of new advisors in the form of the IRT and the IAG, is that good practice?
I think that's very good practice. I think that's a perfect timing. Whilst we've discussed possible concerns about handovers and or change of staff, new staff coming in would be a good time to have new advisors helping them.
But if that's going to be the position, would you have expected to see a greater clarity in the dividing line between the original set of advisors and the new ones?
I would have expected a decision log in some format from the PMA. That's, I think, the person who's making this decision, if my understanding is correct. If not Gold, but certainly Gold or the PMA, to say why they were saying thank you to the first set of advisors and moving on with the new set of advisors.
As to the new set of advisors, and if we look together to your paragraph 19 at the bottom of page 4 of the executive summary, do you have any reservations about the role that IRT played within the investigation?
I do, far more detail in the bigger report, of course. So overall, the role of a review is to consider conduct of the investigation and advise appropriately. I think there's a lot of decision logs recorded later on and other documentation that show that the IRT, in my view, seem to be almost direct in this investigation rather than advising on it.
And again, we'll come to that in more detail, but what might be the concern that you would have of outside experts directing the course of the investigation itself?
Well, there was a decision made early on by the RMP, I believe it's the PMA, that the RMP would investigate Operation Northmoor Ancestro, as opposed to asking an independent body to lead the investigation. So therefore you have a lead agency, and that's the RMP. Forget roles at the moment, the lead agency. They are directing, they are leading, they are investigating. If you put too much reliance on experts or not, and I'm sure the IRT from Merseyside were very experienced police officers and investigators, somebody's leading the investigation. And unless there's a decision log saying that I've now handed this over to an independent Home Office force to lead the investigation, the lead investigator, I think, was the SIO at the time, Major Cox, Mr. Harvey, Gold Commander, and the PMA is actively involved at that time. So the risk is, of course, the lead agency, the independence of the RMP is not independent. It's being led by a Home Office force that the decision logs do not show that.
Thank you. Can we just look over leaf, please, to your paragraph 20, to a concern that you raised as regard this period of time that you considered as topic 2, so the investigative strategy from July 2016 onwards. You identified in your paragraph 20 that there was still no suggestion of treating any of the DDOs as part of a linked series. Now, you regard that, as you say, as a failing of the investigation. And we will come to it, of course, in due course, but could you help us as to why it is that you regard that in your provisional conclusions as a failing on the part of the investigation?
Linked investigations are very rare. I think that's important to say that. And because they're very rare, they're very difficult and even more challenging. Again, recognised one in the murder manual and in my experience. So if you've got 11 operations that may or may not be linked, I believe they should have been linked. The challenge, therefore, for the SIO on this occasion and Gold Commander is even tougher than it was before when you were investigating maybe 1, 2 or 3 offences. The bits that get missed are patterns of behaviour by people who may be involved in all of the operations, and I believe that wasn't looked at in the detail that the Link series, if it was categorised as such, would have afforded the investigation team.
Okay. Can we turn to topic 3, please, within the executive summary, your paragraphs 21 to 26? Can I invite your attention to the last 2 lines of paragraph 21 for a moment, and a provisional conclusion that you've reached here. The investigation was slow to commence, sluggish in its progress, and was never properly resourced.
Yeah.
And then focusing in particularly on this topic, which is the decision to close the investigation. If we look to paragraph 26 for a moment, your provisional conclusion was that in light of the fact there were clearly outstanding lines of inquiry that were not followed, the decision to close down Operation Northmoor was, as you describe it, inappropriate and premature.
Both are correct, Chair.
Can we just look to both of those provisional conclusions for a moment, dealing with the first, that the investigation was slow to commence, sluggish in progress, and never properly resourced? Can we have your help, please, very briefly, as to why it is you reached that provisional conclusion?
Yes, if I do resourcing first, and maybe split that into staff and then other wider elements of resourcing.
Please.
So pretty much from day one all the way through to the end of the investigation, the appropriate number of staff first were not afforded to the investigation team, documented consistently by the SIO, or SIOs, I should say. That was numbers. I think Colonel Rothschild eventually tells us that the RMP got the right number of staff in 2018, which is a long time after the investigation even started in 14. Forget the first 3 years that I've already described. The second bet then is about skill set. And this investigation, as I've said, correctly, in my view, categorised as a Category A+ investigation by the investigating team, and indeed as a critical incident. So those involved recognise how important, difficult, challenging this was going to be. It needed the very best of their investigators, absolutely. And what I've seen from some of the statements, Colonel Morris, Colonel Rothschild, and some of the documentation around people's skill set, is that I don't believe they had the skills to be able to fulfil this job completely. One of the SIOs appeared to have been on his course about a month before being asked to run this investigation. The wider piece of resourcing is, where do you work from? I remain disappointed and a bit surprised that the dedicated location for the RMP to work from took a long time for them to be able to be given the right accommodation, and then there's a question about whether that was the right accommodation because of its location. But that was, I think, 2015 or 16.
It was, in fact, it was February 2016, with staff being first deployed there in August of 2016.
Yeah, so again, Chair.
So in effect, 2 years after the operation began,
yes,
that saw a central location for them to operate from identified and then occupied.
Yes. So if we just take the accommodation, the numbers of people and the right skills of people, that was the driving elements behind my comment of inappropriate resourcing. The sluggish start includes the 3 years where the RMP were not afforded a chance to investigate. And then I've already covered the progress from 14 to 16 was not, from a witness point of view and from an evidential securing and forensic point of view, was pretty slow. Moving to the closure, and again, all of this is, and it's important I say this, as I've said from my report many times, this is based on the documents I've read. But on the documents I read, it seems to me that there are 3 significant lines of inquiry outstanding in June 19 when the operation is closed. One of those appears to be a large number of potential witnesses outstanding in Afghanistan. The second one, if I record it correctly, is about an outstanding action with data and digital evidence that is possibly available, relating directly to the DDOs in 2011. And the third one was a soldier, a British soldier who I believe was still deployed and was coming back from Afghanistan maybe a month or 2 after the decision to close the operation. So without any more information, that's what I've read and I've seen, I would not have closed the operation down with a large number of potential witnesses and forensic evidence still outstanding in the main.
Thank you. Can we turn to topic 4 and capability, which in part you've already touched on when dealing with topic 3, but can we just identify within your section on topic 4, which is the bottom part of our page 6 in the executive summary, paragraphs 27 to 30.
Yes.
You've identified 2 features, if I can perhaps draw your attention to them. First, in paragraph 27, picking up on what you'd said before, the correct number of appropriately skilled staff deployed throughout such a difficult investigation is critical to success. Aside from obtaining of specialist and independent advice, the resourcing of Operation Northmoor in terms of both dedicated staff and location, in my view, was very poor and not in line with the national requirements.
Absolutely, yes.
And can we then just look very briefly to paragraph 30 for a moment? And this picks up again on the theme of the appropriately skilled staff or lack of them. Officers throughout all 3 teams on Operation Northmoor lacked the skills, clearances and experience to conduct an investigation on this scale, and the investigation was not provided with the necessary resources to be successful.
Chair, that is my finding based on the documentation that I've examined.
I won't ask you more about the location since you've already touched on that, but just going back, if I may, to the question of appropriately skilled and experienced staff to conduct an investigation such as this. Do we need to think in terms of skills and experience as being perhaps 2 separate lines of examination for us?
Yes, Chair, I would suggest so. Skills often come from the appropriate qualification and/or courses that people may or may not have attended, and we explore that later in my report. But experience comes from operational experience, and this was a Category A+ investigation, a critical incident, incredibly complex and challenging. This would be some test for any SIO. A hugely experienced SIO would have found this challenging, as would Gold, as would PMA. So I think you have to examine both elements together. Were they appropriately qualified and did they have the experience to do the job?
Okay. That perhaps leads into the provisional conclusions you reach for topic 5 as concerning leadership and command structure. Your paragraphs 31 through to 35. Can we just turn, please, if you wouldn't mind, to the last 2 lines of paragraph 35, which you can find at the top of your page 8 in the executive summary. Your provisional conclusion as regards leadership and the command structure, it's unlikely that those playing key roles would have had the organisational and operational experience required to carry out this investigation in the manner required.
Again, that is absolutely correct based on the limitations of my ability to read all the documents.
Okay. And it may be that if evidence is provided in due course that explains that somebody did have the relevant experience or qualifications, that's an opinion that you might have to revise.
Absolutely correct.
Okay. Can we just very briefly touch on the key roles of the Senior Investigating Officer and Gold and PMA? and just identifying what the concerns you have at this early stage are about the appropriateness of those individuals to occupy those roles. Can we perhaps sensibly, should we deal with PMAs first and go from top down? 2 PMAs for us to consider. What, if any, are your concerns or indeed your endorsement about the decision to appoint either of those gentlemen as the PM, as head of this particular investigation?
So Brigadier Warren, when we look at the document I was given regarding their training courses and qualifications, was limited. So that's a starting point, suggesting that maybe he didn't have the qualifications necessary or experience necessary to run the operation. He was replaced by Brigadier Neal, who certainly had, according to the documentation, more qualification. But I was surprised to find his SIO tells us that he did not keep a policy file or a daybook where he recorded his decisions, by way of example. I think they're on separate A4 bits of paper, which I find surprising, at least. So those 2 elements caused me, I guess, just to ask questions about their capability and leadership for such an operation. Gold Commander, first one, Lieutenant Colonel McAllister. This probably describes the skills and the experience best, because the documents show me he has all of the qualifications to be a good Gold Commander. The experience of non-progression, lack of strategic direction and lack of gold groups point out that, in my view, he did not perform well as a Gold Commander in this investigation when he had all bags of qualifications to do so. Mr. Harvey, I can't find almost anything on his records to tell me what courses he's been on or not. So in the absence of said documentation, I draw the conclusion that it's likely, or possibly anyway, that he didn't have the qualifications. I'm so sorry, just interrupting you for a moment. Assuming perhaps that there is a record in due course which is supplied that demonstrates that he did have the requisite qualifications, in terms of the progress that Lieutenant Colonel Harvey made once he'd become SIO, did he manage the investigation effectively, and did he take things forward at the right pace? So the investigation absolutely went forward at the right pace. From in the main, towards the end of 19, 16, 17 and 18, it's certainly an upkeep, and the pace quickens. But without going to my fuller report, I think the gold groups are lacking in 16 and 17, and that's Lieutenant Colonel Harvey's responsibility. So there is some progress, but there are still some significant concerns.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I think you were about to turn to the 2 SIOs, Captain Wright and then Major Cox.
So again, if the documentation that I've got records qualifications correctly, Captain Wright went on his national SIO course 1 month before he was asked to be the SIO on this investigation. One way of if that's correct, he has never been a qualified SIO on murder investigations before 2014 February, because he hasn't had his qualification. So to ask an unqualified, nationally, unqualified SIO to run this investigation, I think is a big ask of Captain Wright.
You'd observed only a moment or two before that even for a very experienced SIO in a Home Office police force, this would have been a very challenging investigation to run.
If I was asked to run anything like this, there would be 11 investigations as a linked series for either 11 SIOs or 1 SIO to run. That is some challenge, I think.
Can we then turn to consider topic 6, which was Operation Sestro, your paragraphs 36 and 37?
Yes.
You concluded that Operation Sestro at paragraph 36 was carried out in a thorough, methodical and determined manner.
Correct.
As far as that operation is concerned, Were there any issues that you noted that gave you pause for thought or indeed cause for concern?
Well, what I'd say with Sestra, I think Sestra was a good investigation, and I've got the benefit of hindsight. I've been the other side of that many times, so it's easier when you're looking at hindsight. So my commentary is about a perfect investigation. So they could have considered goal support, and that would have given necessarily, if needed, some wider support for the SIO in this investigation, and indeed, as we've seen, good advice from other wider independents may have assisted or not. But I thought Sestra was a good investigation, and the marked difference is the timeliness of, in my view, the investigation.
In that sense, of course, as you'd already observed, the delayed start to Operation Northmoor, 1 of 3 years, no fault of the RMP. Because as it obviously goes, an investigation can only begin when those charged to carry it out are made aware of the fact there is something to investigate.
I agree, Chair, yeah.
So Operation Sestro had that advantage over Operation Northmoor in that it started much closer to the time from which the allegations emanated.
Absolutely right, with contemporary accounts from soldiers deployed.
Given the nature of the investigation, which was into allegations of unlawful killing, when you look at the manner in which the investigation and the operation was run, were you concerned about the fact that there was no recognised Home Office structure such as a gold commander with gold group meetings?
Not unduly, it's a great question, not unduly concerned, because what I could see was compliance with the murder manual. There was an SIO, a different Captain Wright, appointed very quickly. That individual kept really good decision logs that I saw, that you could clearly see the direction of her strategy and tactics to investigate the crime quickly. The people who may be witnesses or not, i.e. the soldiers deployed, were very quickly identified, and I think within a few months, all of them were interviewed for first accounts. So I saw a good investigation as opposed to worrying too much about a bureaucratic structure maybe.
Was any thought given to involving external advisors in the way that Operation Northmoor did? So was anyone brought in from outside to mentor, to assist, or to quality assure that investigation?
Not that I saw from the documentation that I read, no.
Would that be regarded as national best practice within a Home Office police force?
It would be best practice, but also, as I say, absolutely a platinum model for such an investigation. I would have had a gold group on it because of the nature of the allegation. It's a murder allegation again. So it doesn't get more serious. So I would have had a gold group. I would have considered external advice, maybe around media and such like, but not 1,000,000% advisory external on this one, because it was a singular focused operation.
Can we just look very briefly then to your provisional conclusions, which you set out in paragraphs 38, 39 and 40?
Yes.
And perhaps the easiest one to begin with is Operation Sestro, which you've just dealt with. Your conclusion here that bar some minor issues relating to its structure, and of course that relates to the platinum performance practice rather than anything else, but bar some minor issues relating to its structure, Operation Sestro was a sound investigation.
I believe so, yes.
Operation Northmoor, you say, on the other hand, was a complex and incredibly serious investigation that was fundamentally poorly resourced.
I believe it was from start to finish.
And if we remind ourselves, when you talk about resourcing, that is not simply the people charged with conducting the investigation who need to have the appropriate qualifications and experience, but also the facilities provided for them in which they can work and carry out such an investigation.
Absolutely, Chair, yes.
You identify in your paragraph 39 the problem with the high turnover of personnel in important roles, but you also identify in the middle of that paragraph the investigative strategies were hampered by both indecision and or apathy within the chain of command, and by a lack of assistance from UK Special Forces. Can you just help us very briefly with that, because we will turn to that in more detail in the body of your main report?
Yes, I can. So I found the pace of the investigation at both elements really, certainly 14 to 16 and indeed 16 to 19. Whilst it got quicker, the first couple of years of that was still pretty slow. So I think indecision with regard to how quickly or not significant witnesses could have been interviewed is one element. The chain of command, many times when we go through decision logs, you can see the SIOs are asking Gold, McAllister particularly, Lieutenant Colonel, for support, and it doesn't happen. Resources don't happen, accommodation doesn't happen, data acquisition doesn't happen. And then the third reason I mentioned lack of assistance by UKSF. Very early on, the SIO is asking for independent evidence, data, digital footage to assist his investigation, and that either doesn't appear or is very slow to be provided to the investigation team. So they were my three main elements, I think, drawing me to that conclusion.
You identify as well in this paragraph something which we just picked up on, which was the closure of the investigation whilst outstanding lines of inquiry were still waiting to be completed.
That's correct, and they were the three. Well, they were classified, and I believe correctly classified as major lines of inquiry that I mentioned earlier.
If we look to your last paragraph, if we may, please, Mr. Pughsley, together, you record, ultimately, while some elements were in line with best practice, the RMP simply did not have the resourcing or staffing capabilities to carry out Operation Northmoor to an acceptable standard.
That is my overall finding based on everything we've discussed thus far.
And what we'll do in the course of looking at the main body of your report is to pick up on those aspects that have driven you to that provisional conclusion. And of course, as with any of your provisional conclusions, it may be that that's one that you stand by in due course. It may be that that's a conclusion that needs to be revised, subject to material that hasn't yet been provided being shown to you, or subject to any further witness statements or evidence that might be called before the inquiry.
I understand, and that makes complete sense.
Now, having dealt with that brief introduction to your provisional findings, can we go to the body of your main report, please? And can we try to understand the process that you have undertaken by comparing your experience in a civilian world to the military-based investigation that was conducted by both Operations Northmoor and Sestro? It may help if we begin in the main body of your report at your paragraph 16. That takes us to the bottom of page 6, tab B, in the small ring binder file you've got in front of you.
Thank you.
You've mentioned a number of times already the murder investigation manual. And when we look, please, to the national guidelines and best practice against which you measured the performance of the investigators and the two operations, did you have in mind first the murder investigation manual, as well as the major incident room standardised administrative procedures? And then did you consider whether there was any bespoke relevant military guidelines or legislation that needed to be considered by you?
That is exactly the process, Chair, and the appropriate, of course, additions of those manuals at that time.
And in seeking to apply civilian guidelines and best practice to a military investigation, is that, in fact, what the RMP themselves tried to do when they embarked on Operations Northmoor and Sestro?
That's absolutely my understanding of what they tried to do through the documents I've seen, yes.
So we shouldn't think that you've tried to apply novel and inappropriate best practice to an entirely different context.
Absolutely not, and there is strong evidence of compliance with certainly the structure. We've already mentioned Gold, SIO, decision logs and such like. So lots of evidence of trying to, and on occasion, complying with the murder manual.
And indeed, of course, we've already remarked with your help about the structure in place, such as gold meetings, the use of an SIO, and indeed, as we'll see in due course, at one point there is a silver commander appointed and silver meetings eventually take place.
That is correct, Chair, yes.
So the language being used by the RMP is Home Office language, and the structure that they put in place, certainly for Operation Northmoor, was they recognised best practice structure used throughout Home Office police forces.
I agree. That's correct, yes.
Now, it'll be a relief for everyone to know that I'm not going to take you either to or through the murder investigation manual. It's been produced as one of your exhibits, and I'm sure everyone will want to read it in due course. But in the event that we do need to refer to it, paragraph numbers will suffice. We don't need to look at the actual document itself.
Okay.
What I'm going to try to do, if at all possible, is to identify some of the critical roles that we've already touched upon, and then turn to consider the various topics that we've already identified at the outset and the conclusions you've just given us. I mean, the starting point, leaving aside the number of deaths that were being investigated and potentially the number of additional operations that might have been brought in were this a linked series, if one thinks in terms of it just as a basic murder allegation, so an investigation into an unlawful killing, does that itself pose challenges for an investigator?
I believe yes, and certainly the manual says likewise. Murder investigations are often the hardest investigations to carry out for more than one reason. They can be very, very challenging, very complex, and very resource and staff intensive. And of course, they're probably one of the offences that the public look to the investigating body to investigate incredibly well because of public trust and confidence. It is one of the most important investigations that the investigators have to get right.
And indeed, you identify from the Murder Investigation Manual a quotation at your paragraph 25, page 8. The investigation of homicide presents unique challenges to investigators. Some of these challenges arise because homicide is a serious crime and bringing offenders to justice is a priority for both the public and the police. And that must apply in a civilian context just as it does in a military context.
In my opinion, yes.
But of course, we'll need to consider in due course the wider context, such as that the investigation, if it was to happen at the time of the allegations being made, needed to take place in a conflict zone with all of the problems that might entail. So access to witnesses, to crime scenes, to forensics and the like might not be as straightforward as it sometimes is for a civilian police force. But in terms of the challenges presented, just dealing with the question of this being a homicide investigation,
yes,
the same unique challenges apply to both.
Absolutely, in my view, yes. And I'm sure that the context, the military context, makes a difference, but others will be able to describe how much of a difference. I'm not sure some of the delays in getting hold and speaking to witnesses, the answer cannot surely be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years later, I'm sorry, it's the military combat zone or whatever that is. I stand to be corrected on that, but that some of the witness statements were taken in 2018 and the DDOs took place in 2011.
And the investigation began in 2014?
Yes. So there's quite a period of time for others to be able to answer better than me. I stress mine again is a document examination.
In terms of trying to meet these unique challenges, you'd identified 3 roles being critical to the success of any murder investigation: Chief Constable, Gold Commander and SIO, Senior Investigating Officer. And of course, we've touched on those roles very briefly during the course of your summary of provisional conclusions. But can we have your help, please, with the significance of each of those 3 roles and what it is that you would have expected the individuals occupying them to do during the course of the investigation?
Yes. So Chief Constable, Commissioner, Home Office, Police Forces, I think the PMA is the nearest role that the RMP have in this investigation. So taking a step back, if that was in that role, that is the one that is a step or two or three or four away and back from actual hands-on leading the investigation. That should be done by Golden SIO, which I come to in a second. So the Chief Constable or the PMA should be set in absolutely total support for Gold and Silver to be able to do their job, whether that's resourcing, whether that's finances, whether that's accommodation, whether that's unlocking any barriers to the acquisition of, in this case, sensitive data to protect the anonymity and or ongoing operations. Absolutely at the highest level, I think Gold has to make sure the PMA, the Chief Constable, will be doing that right at the top of the organisation. Gold then, as described in the manual, sets the strategic direction for the investigation. So whether that's an overt investigation, whether it's a covert investigation, and documented through the report, then the role of Gold, which we can unpick if necessary through terms of reference and a Gold direction at the highest level, a strategic direction for the SIO to then lead the investigation and deliver against Gold's strategy. So if an overt investigation, Gold's strategy is to investigate it, the SIO is the lead investigator, as per the manual.
Just so we understand the positions and how you've applied your experience to this analysis, you've obviously told us you'd previously been an SIO on any number of serious investigations, including into homicide.
Yes.
You told us that you've been a Gold commander, again, on any number of investigations. As far as Chief Constable, during your time with Kent Police between 2009 and 2022, were you first the Assistant Chief Constable, then the Deputy Chief Constable, and then the Chief Constable?
I was. That's 2009 to 2000, whenever I retired, 2021 sort of period, 22.
So in terms of understanding the significance of these particular roles and then assessing the way in which individuals have carried them out, your expertise has the benefit not only of qualifications, but also of particular experience in carrying out each of these three roles.
That's correct, yes.
And again, obviously in a civilian context, and if in the course of any evidence that's presented a little later on, you understand that there are unique features of the military investigation that need to be borne in mind, that might revise your opinions. But
correct, yes, absolutely.
When it comes to the structure and the challenges presented by the investigation and how that impacts on everyone performing these three roles, do you regard your experience and your previous holding of these roles as giving you a unique insight as to how they ought to be carried out?
It's always hard to talk about oneself, but yes, I do. I absolutely do.
You've touched on very briefly with the timing of Operation Northmoor and the delay to the start of the investigation. I'm not going to rehearse through with you the elements of the various DDOs or indeed the chronology of events from 2011 up to 2014, because you touch on it in your report, and indeed evidence has already been called by way of my opening and indeed in part some of the evidence which has been gisted into public. But just picking up where we began with you, which is the concern about the delay to the start of the investigation. How significant, just as an overview, was it to the chances of success for Operation Northmoor that these allegations emanate from events in early 2011, but no investigation began for nearly 3 years?
I think it's significant, Chair. Absolutely directly has a negative impact on the starting position for the RMP investigation in 2014. even if in 2014 they had chosen to immediately, for example, go and interview those deployed on those operations, it's some 3 years later. So they were denied the early opportunity of contemporaneous witness accounts in 2011, which could have been crucial. Even if you couldn't attend the scene, which I think would have been highly likely from the documentation I've read, you would still have been able to identify witnesses, identify those deployed and consider interviewing them as witnesses. You would have been able to, I'm sure, identify at that time independent video and or digital data. That would have been, as we all know, crucial to get into the truth of the matter, because it would be completely and utterly independent. And then thirdly, alongside of that, no opportunity to consider any forensics, and there may have been an opportunity around ballistics and or firearms. So those three key elements to me, fundamental elements to the initial investigation of a serious crime, were not afforded to the RMP until they were told about it in 2014.
The investigation commenced, in fact, on the 31st of March of 2014.
Yes, thank you.
Can I invite your attention in your report, please, to paragraph 79.
Yes.
And you set out there, I believe that if these events had been dealt with differently and shortly after the operations were conducted, the RMP would have had an opportunity to investigate the allegations in a more timely, efficient and effective manner.
Absolutely.
You then identified in your paragraph 80 that the delay between the allegations between the incidents from which the allegations arise taking place and then the start of the investigation, a period of some 37 months, you describe it as having heavily compromised the investigation. It may be difficult for you to answer this, and it may be that we'll have to come to consider it during the course of the rest of your evidence, and indeed in due course as and when if you do come back. But that delay of 37 months, did it make it impossible for anyone to investigate these allegations efficiently and effectively?
A great question. I don't think impossible, no. I don't think impossible, no. I've got, experience of serious crime reviews that I've been involved in where we've investigated and solved murders for many years previously. So I think, therefore, possible, yes. Did it make it incredibly difficult? Yes. So I think incredibly difficult, but not impossible.
And when we think in terms of the ability of an organisation to overcome those incredible difficulties, did anyone within the RMP have available to them either the qualifications or the experience that would have enabled them to overcome those difficulties?
So not that I've seen, based on everything I've experienced. If you look at, and it's only my experiences now, of course, but if you look at Home Office forces and you look at their cold case review teams, which is sort of those teams that look at historic allegations, they are often populated with the very best investigators that the force has. For that reason, it's incredibly difficult when you have no golden hour principles that you can adapt and adopt through your investigation.
And picking up on a theme that you told us before about the need for independent advice and assistance, even in Home Office investigations where the very best are made available to conduct the inquiries, does that investigation still seek assistance from outside to quality assure and review what it's doing?
Yes, and again, that's best practice. Whether you go to National Crime Agency, as was done on this occasion, or you go through my old role, the chair of the Crime Coordinating Committee, to the homicide workforce, and you ask them to find another force that may have experienced something similar to come and review your activity. Normal practice in Home Office murder investigations of this significance.
So in terms of overcoming the difficulties presented by that delay, not impossible, but it would need a team of significant skill and experience to overcome those challenges.
In my view, yes.
So I'm going to turn now to deal with some of the different topics. I'm entirely in your hands whether that's an appropriate moment for a short break for Mr. Pughsley or not.
Indeed. Let's take a short break till 12:30.
Well, I'm sure everyone would like to wait till 12:30 because they're
I'm so
probably
sorry.
bored of me already. But I was wondering whether you might start at 11:30 or... I'm told that RTS will need probably a little bit. Could I ask at 11:35? It will take 20 minutes to organise the turning off and then the starting again of the system.
Indeed. On balance, 12:35. Thank you.
I think you meant
Oh, sorry.
11:35.
I gather the problem with the transcriber is being fixed, but not for some of all the feeds.
Well, I understand certainly we're in a position to continue now. I believe that those that need to have access to the feed are in a position to hear and see it. And the difficulty with the transcription itself has been corrected, so there'll also be the live feed on the transcript. So can I politely turn my back and simply say, if at any point anyone's team identifies that they can't see or hear what they need to, will they let us know, and we'll try to correct it as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Mr. Pughsley, what I'd like to do is to continue with the theme that we were on, which is identifying how things began when the investigation itself started. You've told us a little bit about the key 3 roles, and we know something with your provisional conclusions of the people that occupied those roles and some of the themes that we will be looking at as we go through your evidence and on. What I'd like to do is to start, if I may, in your report with the background to the events at paragraph 81. So page 19 for all who are following in the page numbers. And following the commencement of the investigation that became Operation Northmoor on the 31st of March of 2014, the PMA at that stage, Brigadier Warren, was identified as the chief officer. So that key critical role with the wider strategic view that you told us about, yes. A role, of course, you yourself have occupied. We know that he then appointed as his Gold Commander Lieutenant Colonel McAllister and the SIO Captain Wright. And just dealing with the 3 of them very briefly, if I may, as far as Brigadier Warren is concerned, plainly he would not have had the same sort of experience as a Home Office officer in the same position that he was in. But did you have any reason to question whether he was the appropriate person to be appointed as the chief officer for an investigation of this sort?
No, I haven't.
Okay. And he himself addressed the question of independence quite early on, after he had decided that the RMP would be the likely candidates for these investigations. And it was a combination of a number of different strands that were coming together under the title of Operation Northmoor. So we have the complaints made on behalf of the Saifullah and Norzai families.
Yes.
Together with the allegations of mistreatment of Afghan detainees, which had been investigated as part of Project Elsinore, and then examination by the RAF-SIB as Project Isoptic.
That is correct, Chair, yes.
Now, in drawing different investigations together and under one umbrella of Operation Northmoor, what issues do you think the PMA needed to grapple with at a very early stage?
I think probably two or 3. One, scale, without any doubt whatsoever. Just the scale of what whoever was going to investigate this was being asked to investigate, number 1. Then linked to that, when you understand the scale of it, the resource and implications. One follows the other, I guess. And then thirdly, I think, and you touched on it, who would be the best body to investigate the allegations? Who should lead the investigation? There were probably 3 things. I'm sure there were many more, but 3 things that would no doubt be at the head of the PMA.
Could we deal with those in reverse order, if you don't mind, for a moment? If we just think first in terms of who should investigate, who should lead the investigation, and then on who might be appointed to particular roles.
Yes.
If we think about a military police investigation into the activities of the military, did the PMA have an eye to the question of independence and whether there was a different investigative body that could conduct the investigation better than the RMP?
I think the documents that I've seen, there was consideration to whether or not a Home Office police force, that's probably the only best way and best comparison, could or should have been utilised as the lead investigators. The RMP were chosen by Brigadier Warren, and he directed, I believe, through Gold, the assistance of external experts and advice from Home Office policing to assist.
So, from what you've seen, he, the PMA, Brigadier Warren, had an eye to the issue of independence at the outset.
Yes,
He made a decision that it would be the RMP who would conduct the investigation,
he did.
but then, in keeping with best practice, ensured that there were outside agencies or individuals instructed to offer assistance, advice, review, or quality assurance.
That's correct, Chair, yes.
And in forming a structure such as that, in any way did the PMA get to a stage of almost having a hybrid team in place?
I think the nearest at this stage a hybrid team was in formation was the wider role of the NCA advisor, in that not only was that, which is Mr. Am I allowed to say his name? Sorry, I'm just pausing for a second.
In terms of which, I'm so sorry.
The NCA.
Yes, you can.
I can.
It's Mr. Williams.
Thank you. So, Mr. Williamson, he had the role of course, advice and guidance and providing, therefore, best practice and experience around witness interviews and such like. But he was also, as a experienced qualified investigator, PIP 4, asked to mentor the SIO and liaise with goals. So he had a wider responsibility. So I think that's the nearest it comes to at this stage to somebody working closely alongside, rather than just advising.
So if we just look at that for a moment and we're thinking about the very start of the investigation, the PMA identifies the question of independence as an issue that he needs to consider and decide upon.
Yes.
He concludes that the RMP should be the investigative body to lead the investigation.
Yes.
But in keeping with best practice, certainly in accordance with the Murder Investigation Manual and with other Home Office police forces, he ensures that there is outside help from, in particular, the NCA, who's that officer in a position to mentor his SIO.
That's correct, Chair, yes.
So in terms of that process that he went through, and obviously this is based on the papers that you've seen and nothing more, do you think he turned his mind properly to these issues at the very outset, identified what they were, addressed them, and took reasonable decisions?
So in the main, the answer is yes to that. What I can't answer is whether or not he considered the skill set of the people we're talking about. So structurally, yes. But a senior officer, whether that's Gold or indeed the PMA, would have to also decide, if we take Captain Wright as an example, he has the experience to do this job.
We'll look at Captain Wright in just a moment because I'm going to work my way down the chain if you don't mind. But although there may not be a document that identifies whether he did or did not have an eye to the skills and the experience of those who were going to be tasked with the investigation, if he's taken the steps of bringing in outside mentoring help, so a proper PIP 4 qualified investigator who is from that point going to offer mentoring assistance and advice to his SIO, Captain Wright, in some way does that offset the lack of experience that Captain Wright had and give him the assistance he needs to advance the investigation?
I think once the PMA had decided that the RMP, would be the lead investigators, the description that you've just described is the best course of action that he could then have made.
Because if one thinks just about that independent assurance, one has a mentor for the senior investigating officer who comes from the NCA.
That's correct.
And we've got a MERT team who are being brought in from Greater Manchester Police to offer their assistance in terms of ongoing review.
Correct.
So we have two significant Home Office bodies that are you can draw experience and expertise from to help the RMP carry this forward.
I think that's a strong position once the original decision has been made.
Right. As to the original decision, can I ask you this? And again, this is based, of course, only on the documentation you've seen. Do you pause for thought when you consider that original decision, which is that it will be the RMP to conduct this investigation rather than an entirely outside body or a hybrid involving a combination of Home Office police officers as well as military trained investigators?
I do pause for thought. And again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. I think a better decision would have been a hybrid model. I think you have to understand and have expertise from the military for the obvious reason, and that needs to be front and centre in any of the investigation. But this was so complicated and challenging for some of the reasons we've already said. I think I would have asked a Home Office police force to identify an incredibly experienced SIO. And I wonder if a model could have been Home Office Force SIO, Captain Wright as his or her deputy, Gold would still be the RMP and the PMA would still be the RMP. That would have, I think, added value to the experience of Captain Wright for any future similar scenario we hope we never have to face, but he would there become better experienced in this field.
So that would see Captain Wright not only have the assistance of the NCA and Mr Williamson, but would also place him in a deputy role as the deputy SIO so that he could learn from whoever was tasked to be the SIO and lead the investigation.
I think that would have been the best model, with the RMP retaining overall independence lead investigator through Gold and PMA.
And since you've mentioned Captain Wright and the SIO, just following that up, if I may, do your concerns about Captain Wright, is that a repetition of what you've already said, namely that he had only just attended the SIO course and, as far as you're aware, had never acted as the SIO in any serious investigation?
That is the biggest concern with regard to what he'd done before as a qualified SIO. And if he's only qualified in February 14, as a qualified SIO, that cannot be very much.
And we remind ourselves that this would have been an enormous challenge for even a highly experienced SIO from a Home Office police force.
Absolutely right.
What about the decision to appoint as the Gold Commander Lieutenant Colonel McAllister?
So again, certainly as I mentioned earlier, if you appoint the Gold Commander based on the qualifications that Lieutenant Colonel McAllister has, it seems a very sound appointment. He has an abundance of the qualifications necessary to perform this role well.
Okay. So in terms of the decisions that were made, if one's trying to identify those that you might be critical of, at least on a provisional basis, there's a question in your mind as to whether or not the decision to use the RMP as the sole investigative body is the right one.
That's correct, Chair, yes.
There's a question as to whether Captain Wright was the best person to appoint as an SIO.
Based on experience as opposed to qualification, yes.
But as to the other decisions, at least at the outset, are you of the view at this stage that the PMA, Brigadier Warren, identified problems and dealt with them as best as he could in the situation in which he was in?
Absolutely right, other than if he appointed Captain Wright, because of what we've just said about his qualification.
All right. Now, when you told us about your reservations about the pace and the way in which the investigation had proceeded, you'd identified, of course, within the resource head, those who were going to carry out the investigation and whether they had the relevant qualifications and experience, but also falling under resources, you'd identified at its most basic level where the operation was going to base itself.
Absolutely right. And I mentioned the wider position. For me, that's the PMA role. The PMA should be, we're working out of there, and that's the end of the conversation.
So in terms of identifying problems at the outset, independence he'd looked at, he'd considered who should or should not conduct the investigation, and it seems who should or should not fulfil certain roles within the investigation. But if the PMA is responsible for the wider strategic oversight of an investigation, leave aside those issues of independence and staffing for a moment, does where the operation actually runs from, is that the third in line of the most important things to look at?
Yes, it absolutely is. And if I understand it correctly, as I say, the PMA, the chief officer, nearest thing to a chief constable, that has to be his role. If it's not his or her role, I don't know whose role that is. If that was a Home Office force, the chief constable would allocate the room, the location for the operation to run out of. So if I understand it correctly, and the PMA is in charge of the RMP in total, then he or she should be identifying the location.
And in terms of the appropriate location, presumably you have to bear in mind the sort of material that might need to be stored at any location.
Of course, so security and sensitivity would have been at the paramount and at the forefront, but I'm sure, I stand to be corrected, I'm sure the military could absolutely find the right location. They're used to dealing with very sensitive information, I'm sure.
So it's not simply a case of saying, I need office space for so many individuals in a building in this particular location. You've at least got to have an eye to the sort of evidence that is going to be stored at that centre and the nature of the material that will have to be examined by those conducting the investigation.
That's absolutely correct, yes.
So appropriate security clearances for those involved, as well as having an appropriate centre that can house the sort of secure information that's being provided.
That would make sense, yes.
So it may not be as straightforward as simply demanding floor space in a particular building, but are you surprised that the PMA was not able to wrestle accommodation from the MOD in anything less than 24 months?
Yes, very surprised. I go back to the categorisation. I'm sure the PMA will be briefing whoever he had to brief, but this, in my view, was correctly categorised as a Category A plus investigation. The definition is out of the manual, and it tells you you're going to need more resources than normal, etc. for this, hence the categorisation. So that it already categorised it that way. The accommodation piece for me then follows.
And even if at the outset of the investigation there hadn't been any links drawn between the other DDOs that might form part of a linked series, we're not just dealing with one investigation into one incident. At the outset, we're dealing with a number of investigations into a number of different incidents.
You mentioned him a moment or two ago, you know, when the three elements all came together, it was a massive investigation, and then eventually focus into some of the DDOs.
You touch upon it in your report that as far as the timescale for the occupation of the final office space in Cornwall, the location was eventually identified in February 2016. Staff began to locate there in the summer of that year, in August 2016. But you identified part of the evidence that Brigadier Rothschild gave when he gave evidence before the chair. Can I just take you to it, your paragraph 90 for a moment, please, Mr. Pughsley?
Thank you.
As he then was, Colonel Rothschild detailed how appropriate resourcing was critical to the success of Operation Northmoor, and doubtless that's a view with which you agree, given the way in which you've described the vital need for appropriate resources. You then noted that in his, Colonel Rothschild's, evidence, even though the investigation started in March 2014, it was not until 2018 that all the required resources were in place. So if we just pause for a moment, Operation Northmoor commences on the 31st of March 2014. It's either just less or even just over 2 years later when premises are found and then start to be used. But it's not, in fact, until 4 years after the investigation begun that all the required resources were in place.
That is correct, yes.
Now, it may well be that you've not been privy to any documentation that explains why there was such a protracted delay.
Not in specific detail, but from the reading I've seen, some of it is around clearance of staff, I think some of it is about location, and you mentioned Cornwall, whether staff can get there or not. But when I mentioned slowness and apathy and sluggishness, this is one example of that. It seems to take an extraordinarily long time to find the right location, and then 4 years later, if we take 14 as the start point, all of the appropriate staff, both in numbers and maybe skill set, are in place according to, Brigadier Roger.
I mean, if you were the Chief Constable, the PMA in this case, and you've embarked on an investigation of this size and significance, and you've looked for appropriate staff with the right skills and experience, if you were told you had to wait for 2 or possibly 4 years before your investigative team could be housed in the right location with all the right resources, how would you feel about that?
I would have feel, well, one, bitterly disappointed and let down. The slight difference is I'd have nowhere else to go in the force because I'd be in charge of everything. PMA, I guess, could go somewhere in the military. But I would have then, if it was I'd have to go nationally. I'd have to go to my colleagues across other forces and ask for resourcing from other forces on a mutual aid agreement to be able to investigate something of this significance. So I'd have to go wider to get the resource. The
way you phrased it, that is your consideration of this problem in the report. If we look, please, to paragraph 91, but to the top of page 21, as to the time it took from the commencement of Operation Northmoor until the arrival in Cornwall, you describe that as, I do not believe that this length of time is acceptable in resourcing a declared Category A+ murder investigation, which has additionally been recognised as a critical incident.
Those two definitions put this investigation at the highest level it could possibly be.
And it may be very difficult to assess the level of the impact that there was on Operation Northmoor by the delay to resourcing, such as not being properly housed in Cornwall for a number of years. But can you give us some idea of what you think the impact might have been on the investigation?
Any investigation without the right location to work from and the right resources, number and skills to be quickly, in a timely way, delivering the actions raised by the SIO or Gold. If you can't do, I'm afraid that's basic for this style of investigation. That's not something extraordinary in my view. Somewhere to work from and the right people to do the job. Once the organisation has said this is a really serious place, this is a really serious investigation. If you feel not supported in that way, whether it's an investigator or one of the senior officers, I think you would feel very, very disappointed. And I guess you would feel how seriously are we taking this? Or and I'm sure this isn't the case, are we just rubber stamping the definition and not putting the resources into it? I hope that's not the case.
I mean, the issue of resourcing, is that something that comes up in a number of the documents that you've seen, questions being asked about why we aren't properly resourced, when will we be properly resourced?
Yes, I have seen that, and you know, the most consistent, understandably, author of that is Captain Wright, and indeed Major Cox when he takes over, the SIOs. Was
it also something that was remarked on by the independent external agencies, the MERT team and the NCA?
So when I mentioned earlier, the recommendations appear to be ignored. That's what I mean in the main. They from very early on, the very first documentation, there is highlighted the need for the appropriate resource, skill set and staff. And then as the reviews and the reports build, the concerns are raised about this was said, this was recorded, this was asked for, but it's still not in place. So you can feel the frustration, I believe, through the NCA reports, that's for sure. You can feel the frustration building through the report.
And just keeping, if we can, with the issue of resourcing in this period of time, we touched upon it earlier on about the change in key personnel relatively close to each other. So the change in PMA, the change in gold, and then a little later the change in SIO. If I just invite your attention, if I can, for a moment to paragraph 96 on the page that we're currently on. The changes in personnel to these three critical roles midway through the investigation presented some risk to the investigation. Pausing for a moment, there may be any number of reasons why there is a change in personnel. It may be within a military context because somebody has moved on to a different job. It may be as a result of a promotion. It may be because of ill health. It may be because people are deployed. But just thinking about the fact that this is declared as a Category A+ critical incident, would you expect to see the change in key roles like this happened quite so close together?
No, I wouldn't. I accept all the reasons that you've mentioned, that people can move and change. That's happened through my whole career. It does happen. But I'm afraid if they had to happen, I would have looked at an incremental change and a handover process. Gold and the PMA, particularly with the PMA playing the role that he played, Brigadier Neil, he seems to be closer to the investigation than maybe the previous brigadier. For those two to change within, I think, 3 months is a significant risk to the operation, and you have to mitigate it. As I said, the SIO, there's some confusion because, in my mind anyway, Captain Wright leaves, I think, in 17, but almost immediately Major Cox is writing decision logs as the SIO shortly after Lieutenant Colonel Harvey's appointment as Gold. So I'm not sure who the SIO is, or maybe they're both an SIO at that period of time. There's a little bit of confusion in my mind.
And again, it may be difficult to identify specific risks, but in terms of general risks that an investigation might be exposed to when key personnel move on, particularly at the same time.
Yeah.
Can you help us with some of those, please, Mr. Pughsley?
Well, I suppose if you start at the top, the first one would be, does the new brigadier, the PMA, does the new PMA understand the resourcing implications, the finance and the location implications at the highest level that is impacting directly on the inefficiency of this investigation? The Gold Commander directs the strategy to investigate. Anything could be lost in that conversation, whether it's conversation with families, whether it's conversation within the military, whether it's conversation elsewhere. And the SIO, and they're both he's on this occasion, they could easily, if not handed over properly, there's a plethora of lines of inquiry. You could miss any one of them, but you may miss the importance of some of the high priorities, fast-track actions. And that's just some. You know, any operation, a handover is a risk, but it does happen and it can happen, but I'm not sure I would have done all three pretty close together.
And in terms of how Operation Northmoor tried to manage the difficulties presented by those changes, have you seen or been provided with any notes of any handovers between the outgoing and the incoming key three roles?
No, the only document I have seen and read was a SIO log policy file from Captain Wright, where he talks about having a handover with Major Cox. To follow that on, I've then not seen any handover notes. Gold and PMA, I've not seen any documentation with regard to handovers.
And if we just look to your provisional conclusion as regards these changes in key roles, if we turn to the end of your paragraph 98, which is the bottom of the first paragraph at the top of page 22. When leading an organisation as a chief constable, I believe this would have presented me with too much risk and is not a decision that I would have made in such circumstances.
So that's absolutely right based on everything I've seen. If there were wonderful, detailed handover notes, then maybe my position could be different. But on what I've seen, that risk is too high for me.
Well, it may be in due course that individuals will provide statements or give evidence about the detailed handover that they received. It may just be that the documentation hasn't as yet been provided to us, but based on the paper review that you have conducted, given the absence of the handover notes, you believe that too much risk was presented to the investigation as a result of these key changes?
in the short period of time that they took place, yes, I do.
In terms of the context of the investigation that was being conducted, which is obviously something to bear in mind when one's considering at the outset strategy and the like, can we just have your help, please, as regards the fact that this was an investigation into allegations against UK Special Forces? What I'd like to do, please, is to look, if you wouldn't mind, first at your paragraph 101, which identifies the protocol in place, which Colonel Rochell, now Brigadier Rochell, gave evidence about, and then your observations in respect of it, paragraphs 102 and 103. So they are the bottom of page 22, the page we're currently on.
Thank you.
Now, the 2008 protocol, as we already know, identified it was incumbent on all Special Forces personnel to assist the service police when they are undertaking one of the investigations. And then activities of Special Forces personnel are highly sensitive, and that the maintenance of operational security is paramount in order to ensure the continued operational effectiveness of the Special Forces. And then UKSF personnel involved in an incident that required investigation were permitted a period of 24 hours before statements were taken by the SIB. So aspects of the protocol identified by Brigadier Rochell. If I take you over the page, please, Mr. Pughsley, to your paragraph 103 for a moment. In terms of the interaction between the RMP and UK Special Forces, how have the observations of Colonel Rochell that we've just looked at been applied?
So I think through the documentation you can see careful consideration to ensure compliance with the protocol. And I think that's probably where I mentioned earlier, compliance with Home Office guidelines plus military uniqueness, and this is one case. So certainly thought is given to it by the SIOs and Gold Commanders. The compliance with it, in my view, and you know, they're written 1, 2, and 3. I don't know if they're in priority order, but that's how they're recorded. I believe 2 overtook priority-wise of number 1 during this investigation, and there are 2 major reasons why I say that, if I may continue.
Please.
The first one is that from a very early stage right to the end, indeed, even at closure, it appears that data and digital products are still outstanding, and to get those from UK Special Forces seems to have been difficult all the way through this operation. So that sort of goes against you must support the investigation, point 1. And point 2, there is a huge delay, in my view, from 2014 to 2018, I think 17 and 18, between acquiring statements from the soldiers deployed as per the investigation and the protocol. So I accept that strategy in 14 was slightly different to 16. In fact, very different, wasn't it? But in 16 onwards, it's still the best part of 18 months to 2 years before statements are taken. So they pause a thought in my mind that suggests to me that point 2, protection at all costs, is outweighing the ability and the direction to support the investigation.
And as you see it, the prioritisation that appears to have been given to maintaining operational secrecy over above the cooperation with the investigation.
Yes.
Is that something that was identified by the officers tasked with conducting Operation Northmoor?
I don't remember reading that on any document. The frustration is clear on many, many documents. So that is my view, having read many documents in this regard. I don't recall reading those words recorded exactly by anybody, but the frustration and the difficulty and the challenge is on many documents.
For example, in the documents that deal with the seizure of the ITS-1 computer server?
That is correct, yes.
just so we understand the extent to which you have a pause for thought at this particular moment, from what you've seen on the documentation, have you seen any evidence of interference with the course of the investigation by anyone outside of it?
No, I haven't.
Is that an aspect that the RMP should have been alive to, namely the possibility that they might have frustrations deliberately placed in their path?
So I would think they should have been alive to it. The protocol is written for a reason, and I guess it's written that way because in the past maybe things have been difficult on previous investigations. But when I talked about pace earlier, I accept totally the protection of tactics and security and operations, and I accept totally the absolute need to protect the anonymity of these soldiers. My question all the way through this is that seems to have been, it shouldn't have taken that long with all of those protections in place to be able to allow an investigator to speak to, I think, the people deployed on those operations.
Can we look, please, as best as we can now in a chronological order at the way the investigation proceeded after those initial decisions were taken by the PMA, Brigadier Warren, because we've looked at the question of resourcing and the setup and the problems that you've described to us that then fell to the investigation to deal with. What I'd like to try to do with your help is to look at the way the investigation proceeded after it was commenced at the end of March of 2014 and to take us right up to its closure.
I understand.
We'll be coming back to different themes, and it may involve a little moving around in your report and the documents, but if at all possible, we'll keep it chronological. And again, as I said before when we began, if you find that I'm asking you a question about a paragraph in the report you don't have in front of you, or about a document that you're not sure about, will you tell me? Because it's extremely important that you have all the information available to you to assist the chair to the best of your ability.
I will.
Now, if one thinks that the PMA begins, the RMP are designated as the investigating body, the appropriate structure of GOLD and SIO is put in place, and those roles are then identified. We know that the PMA has the wider strategic outlook, that GOLD is in effect the fundamental support for the SIO and a bridge between the SIO and the PMA.
Yes.
But in terms of the senior investigating officer, at the outset, that being Captain Wright, are there sort of three phases that he needs to focus on when he begins an inquiry of this sort?
Yes, there are.
So we're thinking about sort of his initial response and the instigation of the inquiry. Then do we come to consider investigation, and then ultimately is it case management?
That is absolutely right, through all investigations.
If we just look with your help, please, at our paragraph 105, page 23. Back to a theme that we've had already, and perhaps a theme we're going to pick up on a number of occasions through your evidence. But at the very outset in 2014, he recorded the requirement for staffing and resources as being important.
That is correct.
He made it clear in his notes that to investigate the offences thoroughly and properly, the appropriate resources would be required.
He absolutely does that and continues to document, even at this early stage, the negative impact if he is not provided with the resources.
Can we look at some of the documents that you have reviewed in this regard? It will not be all of them by any stretch of the imagination,
Yes.
but in the hope of trying to assist others how it is you've reached these provisional findings. If I invite you please to pick up bundle 2 and to turn to divider number 38. And it's page 38-2, please.
So tab 38.
Tab 38.
Thank you.
And we have one of the many policy file reports from Captain Wright that you have looked at. And for his benefit, perhaps more than anyone, simply to remind everyone that you had observed that the way in which he had completed a comprehensive policy file was you regarded in keeping with best practice.
That is correct, yes.
This is the 23rd of September of 2014, so nearly 6 months into the investigation itself. And he identifies as his decision, in order to effectively investigate the incident under report, Team 1, that's the team looking at the allegations of unlawful killing, will prioritise this complaint under the management of an SIO, that's himself, a deputy SIO, together with Staff Sergeant McLean Inglis, lead investigator, and then a number of other individuals invited there. As to his reason, Team 1 are responsible for investigating a similar matter and have been broken into 2 sub-teams. More staffing is to be considered and will be reviewed as required. Team members are experienced investigators with the necessary skills to conduct an effective investigation, as the inquiry is likely to deal in the main with PM secret and above material. All personnel are to be appropriately security cleared and are to undergo DV clearance procedures. So at that stage, some 6 months into the investigation, when dealing with the division of Team 1 teams, he's considering the need for more staffing, but he regards his team members as experienced investigators with the necessary skills to conduct an effective investigation.
That is absolutely correct, as he's recorded there, and it's an element that the SIO should be considering in the way that people should have been considering whether he was qualified and experienced. So that looks like good practice to me.
And in terms of the size of the team that he had in mind, if we could turn please to tab 42, and it's page 42.2. Policy file report from the 13th of November of the same year.
Thank you.
Following a further request from Gold, another staffing request has been requested. This is in addition to that which I produced in July. Currently, I have on team SIO, Deputy SIO, 3 Staff Sergeants, 3 Sergeants. I've asked for this to be raised to a total of 6 Staff Sergeants, 6 Sergeants, 1 TIM and 1 dedicated analyst. And then if we look to the very last entry, a doubling of current staff will adequately resource this aspect of the investigation, a notion shared by Detective Superintendent Williamson.
So again, Chair, yes, that's correct. I think of equal importance is the second line that he talks about in his reasoning, which is again a pretty early stage saying insufficient due to the inquiries that we need to do. So one leads to the other.
And in terms of the doubling of staff adequately resourcing the investigation, shared by Detective Superintendent Williamson, he, of course, is the mentor provided to Captain Wright by the NCA. That
is correct, Chair, yes.
And when he talks about the investigation, it's all 3 elements of isotopic, Elsinore, and the one alleged EJK.
Yes. Yes.
Picking up on the same theme, if we can, for a moment, going back, if you wouldn't mind, though, to tab 40. It does work in a chronological order, but not in the bundle, I'm afraid. So tab 40, a decision from the 25th of November of 2014.
Thank you.
Again, addressing the question of resourcing. An experienced disclosure officer will be required within this investigation who has relevant experience of dealing with highly sensitive matters, DV cleared, and understands the SF matters, comfortable with the protective markings that will accompany any material within this inquiry, requested additional staff from officer in overall command, possibly the recruitment of suitably qualified civilian. And as to the reason, disclosure within this investigation is likely to be complex given the organisations we are encountering and recovering material from. RMP, to my knowledge, do not have the in-depth knowledge that is required. Outsourcing of this requirement is recommended. It would seem from this decision and this policy file entry that Captain Wright has identified possibly a gap within the skill set of the investigating team. It might be an important gap.
I agree entirely. That's certainly the indication from the decision log, and the ability to manage correctly sensitive information in due course will be and was then a key requirement.
And of course, Team 1, with which the SIO was principally concerned, is looking into the allegations of extrajudicial killing. In terms of outsourcing this particular requirement, do you know whether any success was had in outsourcing to cover this gap in the skill set for Team 1?
No, I don't, but I would expect this conversation to be had with the NCA mentor advisor. That would be, I guess, exactly part of a conversation the SIO would have been having with his mentor.
Right. In terms of the potential difficulties that were identified by Captain Wright relatively early on, if we just go over to the next tab, please, to tab 41, and it follows on from the outsourcing issue that we've just looked at from November. We now take ourselves to January of 2015. So this is tab 41 and it's 41.2.
Thank you.
Gold has met with the Chief of Staff of the Directorate of Special Forces and agreed that the RMP will be able to copy both the SFHQA server and the current server held by that department, and that it identifies the searches that can be conducted. As to the reason, the securing and preserving of DSF data material was always a main line of inquiry for this investigation and has been slow to achieve. Appropriately cleared staff will be able to conduct searches only previously available utilising DSF staff, thereby pondering an independence question over the data being retrieved. And then the last entry, the storage and handling of recovered material needs to be carefully considered with security considerations in mind. So Captain Wright appears to have an eye to the staffing and resources that he needs within his own team to conduct the investigation.
That's correct.
He has an eye to the need for external assistance, possibly from a civilian source, to be able to deal with some of the more complicated inquiries that might not be able to be made by his team. And he has an eye to the need to secure and preserve sensitive material from UKSF and how that's going to be handled and stored.
All sound decisions through his policy file.
But the decision we've just looked at is January of 2015 for an investigation that commenced some 3 years after the events in March of 2014. So we're 10 months or so into the life of the investigation, and it seems that Captain Wright is identifying possible gaps in his team and the need to find out where best to store and handle material recovered from UK Special Forces.
Absolutely right. And, you know, this is one indication of where I talk about sluggish and pace. It appears that Gold has only recently met with DSF with regard to this really critical element of acquisition of data. It's been running, even if you accept March is your start point, 2014, this is still some time later.
Are you surprised that the issue of how best to handle sensitive material is, it would appear, unresolved 10 months into the start of an investigation which everyone knew would involve UK Special Forces?
Yes, I would have expected Gold to have a very early conversation with, if this is the right staff, Directorate of Special Forces, DSF. That should have been taking place shortly after the investigation commenced, because as you've just said, everybody knew where the data may or may not be.
And perhaps, if necessary, reminding whomever he spoke to that the policy required that it was incumbent on all Special Forces personnel to assist the service investigations.
Yes, if necessary, reminder.
As far as resourcing, and in particular for Captain Wright, did it continue to be a problem for him, as in a problem he identified almost throughout his entire time as the SIO?
Yes, Chair, it did. And we go back to when we was told earlier full resourcing was achieved in 2018. Captain Wright had gone. So it was by taking those two pieces of information, the investigation was never properly resourced under the stewardship of the SIO, Captain Wright.
And is he the sole person who's responsible for resolving the resourcing issue, or is he responsible for flagging it up to others so that they can deal with it?
So the latter. The SIO's role would be absolutely to request that and highlight the risk to Gold, and then Gold would try and resolve it, and then this structure would take that, of course, to the PMA.
And by making the entries that he did in his policy files, and by identifying and setting out discussions that he'd had about resourcing,
Yes.
did Captain Wright do enough as the SIO to try to drive forward the recruitment of the relevant individuals, as well as the sourcing of the relevant storage facilities?
So I think no, based on my experience. I can just picture, and I would have expected, if SIOs were raising this with Gold in such a significant concerning way, and it wasn't being resolved, I can see the SIO knocking on my door if I was the PMA. And I think that happened on one occasion, but I think it should have just been consistent. This was the one chance, I guess, to get that truly independent, if it still existed, digital data, evidence, video, whatever the format may be, of what took place or didn't take place in 2011.
Now, what we've just been looking at arguably falls within that first phase for an SIO, the instigation and initial response phase.
Yes.
Although, as we can see, it appears to have dragged out more than just as an initial first phase. It's continued for months, and indeed continues throughout his tenure.
That's correct.
Can we just have an eye, with your help, to what would be phase 2 for an SIO, which is the investigation phase, where investigative strategies need to be developed and the lines of inquiry identified?
Yes, so once the instigation bit is just grip and control of what you've got and what you're dealing with, in my language. What follows then is identifying the major lines of inquiry under what strategies that the SIO should consider. So that might be witness consideration, if there were anybody categorised as suspects at this time or any time, categorisation with regard to that, a forensic strategy to see whether or not there are lines of inquiry for forensics, and indeed within that data capture, identification, storage and such like. So it's broadening your initial control, you understand what you've got, and now you're expanding into the investigation to try and get the best evidence you possibly can.
Can we then have a look at some of his policy entries that support the steps that he took during the first few months to try to identify appropriate investigative strategy in the main lines of inquiry? Can I take you, please, if you wouldn't mind, your report, paragraph 108. You'd identified there that, having reviewed the documentation, Captain Wright recorded his intention to establish contact with the victims and to try and identify any witnesses to further the investigation.
Yes.
And that he recorded his attempts through the solicitors acting for Mr. Bang and Mr. Fuller to try to speak to those individuals and take statements from them.
That is correct, and he retains personal responsibility for that as well.
With that in mind, can we look, please, in the file that we're still in at divider 47 and page 47.2, which is a policy file report for the 2nd of April of 2014. So within a matter of 3 days of the investigation starting, Captain Wright has an eye to his investigative strategy at the outset.
He absolutely has, and this is in line with the witness-victim strategy.
He identified as his decision in regards contact with victims. Around half of the complaints are represented by Lee Day, with others either in detention at Parwan or have recently been released. Lee Day are to be contacted directly by the Op Northmore investigation team, but only by the SIO or Deputy SIO, in order to establish links to inform them of the RMP investigation. It's unknown whether they are in direct contact with their clients. Those who remain in Parwan will continue to be visited by the detention oversight team, where their welfare will be assessed. Those who've been released or will be in the future will have no contact with the investigation team unless forwarding details are left upon discharge. The Victims Charter and associated JSP will not apply in Afghanistan, so the victims in this case will not be afforded the same assistance and services as those in the UK. Whilst RMP are not obliged to provide these services, the investigation team will, where possible, mirror the guidelines and offer such services that are available and appropriate. So in terms of his, Captain Wright's, decision about contact with the victims, he'd identified the need to speak to the solicitors acting for some of the complainants, a need to have an eye to those that might still be detained.
Yes.
And also to bear in mind that if those who have been detained have now been released, it might be difficult to trace them.
Yes.
But he took the decision that whilst the Victims Charter might not apply to those in Afghanistan, he, through the RMP, would do his best to mirror that scheme when making contact with anyone in Afghanistan.
That is correct.
And in terms of that decision by Captain Wright, is that an appropriate one?
Yes, it is. I think it's a good decision. He is given due consideration to looking after and supporting and informing witnesses once identified and or spoken to by the investigating team.
Mr. Pughsley, these policy file reports, what sort of status do they have and what's the purpose of them generally?
So status for an SIO are probably the most important document that he or she will write. They are the guiding document for him to record how he's trying to investigate the investigation, and importantly, his reasons for doing so. The rationale and the reason is really important in this. It's also very important if and when on a long-term complex investigation for review teams to come in and read and see, so they can see the shape of the investigation. So for the SIO only, this should literally be his whole thought process investigating this, any investigation, but certainly this one.
Thank you.
In terms of whether or not he had, at that early stage, or indeed ever, sufficient members of staff to assist him in the endeavours on which he was embarking.
Yes.
We'd looked at the policy decision where he'd asked for a doubling of current staff. That was obviously a decision a few months after the one we've just looked at. That decision was November. But in terms of the doubling of staff, was that for the entirety of Operation Northmore, so for all three teams, or was it only for Team 1, which was investigating the allegations of EJK?
I believe that decision was only for Team 1. There were wider decisions for Team 1, 2 and 3 for the whole investigation. You know, the exec summaries talk about if everybody's resourced 100-odd staff on occasion. Well, that's clearly much more than is being talked about here.
And again, for the avoidance of any doubt, as far as Captain Wright's position as SIO is concerned, is that SIO of all three teams or SIO of Team 1 only?
SIO of Team 1 only.
In which case, continuing with his role as the SIO of Team 1, can we just, in the documents, turn on for a moment, please, to tab 49, a policy decision in October of 2014, our page 49.2. And again, it continues the theme of identifying the victims and Captain Wright's efforts to try to speak with them and take statements from them. He identified here that correspondence had been received from Gold originating from the Treasury solicitors indicating that Lee Day were now representing Mr. Cy Fuller. There's a typographical error there. That's, of course, not how his last name is spelt. This person has not previously come to our attention as a complainant. Measures will need to be instigated to interview him as a witness, taking into account his age, vulnerability, and the significance of the evidence he will provide. He's to be prioritised in a similar manner to Mohammed Bang, with Lee Day being requested to provide further detail and direct correspondence to the RMP, as opposed to communicating via the Treasury solicitors on this matter. The reason perhaps being obvious, Mr. Cy Fuller is a potential significant witness in this case and can provide evidence in relation to the investigation. In terms of prioritising the speaking to Mr. Cy Fuller and Mr. Bang, was that an appropriate decision to be taken by Captain Wright as soon as he became aware of Mr. Cy Fuller's details?
In my view, yes. Prioritising a potential eyewitness to a high priority would be the right thing to do.
And when he wrote about taking into account his age, vulnerability, and the significance of the evidence he will provide, what does that mean, please, Mr. Pughsley?
So age, firstly, and any vulnerability, there are guidelines which Captain Wright was advised of by the NCA on how to deal with and get best evidence from anybody who may be vulnerable, whether that be age or any other reason. And that's achieving best evidence. So there's methods and ways of doing that, and he was given those documents and advised by experts from the National Crime Agency. So importantly for that, if you comply with the best practice rules and guidelines, then the evidence it can be used in a court process. So he's making sure he's getting evidence in a secure and best way. With regard to relation to the investigation, the evidence, I assume at this stage he's thinking at the time, at the scene, therefore eyewitness account of something.
Reminding ourselves, as we've done on a number of occasions, that the investigation began 3 years or so after the events which needed to be examined. Would that place a greater degree of pressure on an SIO to try to make contact with potential eyewitnesses? Yes.
I think any potential eyewitnesses that come to the fore, knowing that this is 3 years after the event or even a little longer at most, would put pressure on the SIO to try and do this as quickly as possible.
I mean, there are obvious challenges in an investigation of this sort, given the geographical problems presented by an SIO based in the United Kingdom and potential witnesses being based in Afghanistan, which was still at this time a conflict zone.
Yes.
Insofar as it's necessary for the SIO to address those issues, was he alive to the problems presented by the situation?
I believe he was alive to it, and we see in due course that he considers other alternative methods of trying to acquire the evidence if not able to see the witness face-to-face as soon as possible.
And can we come immediately to that? If we look over to the next tab, tab 50, and to page 52, we see a policy decision taken a few months later, now January of 2015, following a meeting with the Service Prosecuting Authority and the National Leads for Vulnerable Victim Interviews and Suspect Interviews, the possibility and viability of conducting interviews via VTC, so over a remote link. The decision taken that Mr. Cy Fuller was not to be interviewed in this manner. If you were to try to place yourself in the position of the SIO, what might be the advantages of speaking to somebody face to face, but then what might be the disadvantages in delaying having that interview, if that's not already a very obvious question to answer?
I think face-to-face is the best opportunity any time of any interview, in my experience, anyway. You get a real feel for, of course, the person in the room, whether they're frightened, whether they're scared, whether they're very confident, all the way that you would normally feel when you're speaking face-to-face with an individual. Whether or not there were any communication, as in interpretations issues here, I don't know, but that would be even more problematic, I guess. Easier resolved with an interpreter in the room. When you have to do all of those down the line, it just makes all of that more tricky and more difficult and more challenging, and that you're not in the room and you can't comfort if necessary or reassure. However, all of that said, if the only way you can get this evidence is via video link, rather than, for whatever reason, it's just impossible to see person face to face, I think it's an opportunity that one might have taken if you got an account at an earlier stage. But I note different, again, Home Office policing, you know, advice has been taken, hasn't it, from the SBA. So Wright has gone and asked the advice here of the prosecuting legal authority.
And might that be a prudent step for an SIO to take before he embarks on an evidence-gathering process, if only to make sure that the product that he gets at the end will be admissible in a court?
Absolutely right. You can just imagine an SIO taking a course of action that makes the evidence inadmissible, and what would therefore be said to the SIO. So I think it's absolutely right that he should be exploring acquiring evidence that would be admissible in any court process.
And as far as securing access to, for example, Mr. Bang and Mr. Saifullah, from what you've seen in the documents, did Captain Wright, as the SIO, struggle to get access to them as potential witnesses?
Yes, he does. The interview of Mr. Saifullah takes place sometime later, doesn't it? 2017.
17, yes.
At some time. When they're considering it in January 15.
And as far as the delay is concerned, is that the fault of Captain Wright or anyone else within the RMP, or is that the logistical difficulties presented by getting access to that individual?
I think it appears to be, from the documents I've read, the logistical difficulties. Others would be able to tell you in due course whether or not they could have been removed.
In terms of other early lines of inquiry that were identified by Captain Wright, apart from, of course, identifying the victims and any possible potential eyewitnesses and the efforts that he made to try and secure speaking to them, did he give consideration to the possibility of a scene visit?
Yes, he did. And in normal circumstances, this is absolutely best practice. The normal being removed here in that this is, 3 years later, if not a bit longer, but that doesn't mean that you don't consider it, and it's right and proper that he considers it. The circumstances in Afghanistan, others will know far better than me, so this may well have been impossible. But what he does do is consider alternatives, and I think that, again, that's good practice in my view by Captain Wright as the SIO.
So, just thinking about it for a moment, 3 years or more on from the date of the allegations themselves, a scene visit you regard as still being something that is potentially important for an SIO to undertake?
I do. If all things were equal and you could go safely to this location without any compromise, then I would expect him to go and record the scene.
As to the discussions that he had with others and the other options, can we just look, please, to your divider 53 and to page 2, and a policy file report from September of 2014. The complainant has alleged that when detained at his home address, his family members were unlawfully killed. The scenes of the alleged offences are to be identified in evidence. Where possible, the scene is to be visited. Should this not be possible, evidence detailing why is to be recorded and a reconstruction of the scene is to be considered either in some physical form or by means of full motion video, photography, satellite imagery or geo-mapping. And then in keeping with what you've just told us, the scene of the offence under report is key to understanding what allegedly took place. The alleged offences took place over 3 years ago and the security situation in Helmand province is fragile. In all likelihood, it will not be possible for our MP to visit the scene. If this is the case, evidence detailing why this is not possible will demonstrate the rationale for not doing so. I pause simply to observe something that you will say on other topics, the importance of recording why you take a particular decision rather than simply recording it was decided.
Absolutely right.
And he continued, scene reconstruction through available and historic resources may be the only option available, whether utilising iStar assets or conventional mapping. Accurate scene representation will be beneficial for investigative purposes in order to allow investigators, witnesses, suspects and any future participants in any subsequent disciplinary proceedings gain an understanding of what the ground, area, location was like at the material time of the alleged offences.
Yeah.
So in terms of creating a rationale for what he has decided to do, having identified the potential significance of the scene, but also flagged the difficulties and challenge posed in getting out to Helmand province because of the security situation, he's looked for alternative avenues to be explored. And if it is the alternative avenues that will be explored, he intends to set that out with his rationale in a subsequent decision. And then hopefully the benefit of that alternative means will assist his team, the witnesses to whom he might speak, anybody who might be interviewed, and ultimately, should there ever be any proceedings of any sort, anyone presiding over those.
That's absolutely right, yes. And that's exactly what the full decision, it's good decision log.
Okay. So again, going back to something that you said about Captain Wright at the outset, as to his record keeping, it is in keeping with best practice.
That is correct.
They are fulsome entries. They are regularly entered. His decisions are and discussions are recorded, together with the rationale for any of those decisions.
That's correct, Chair, yes.
And is that what you would expect an SIO in his position to do?
I would, and on occasion, what Captain Wright does from his reason or his rationale is very good practice. That if people make a mistake, that's normally the one, not the decision, it's the why. And he's done that incredibly well on most occasions.
So, notwithstanding the lack of experience that he might have, having only just passed his SIO qualifications the month before Northmoor began, in fact, the lessons learned in that qualifying process he appears to be putting into practice.
Certainly is on his decision logs, yes.
So I see the time. I'm going to turn to a slightly different part of the distinct phases for the SIO. Would that be a convenient moment to break?
It would indeed. Mr. Glasgow, thank you. Mr. Pughsley will adjourn now until 2 o'clock. Please, as I said, all witnesses, do not discuss your evidence with anybody. Meanwhile.
Thank you.
2 o'clock, please. Thank you.